Okay, your audio's off. Very good. Hello, my name is Seamus Kennedy, and this talk is titled The Unique Biomechanics of Running. This will be our opportunity to look at running as a distinct activity from the normal walking gait cycle that we study. And running differs in many ways from walking, as we'll see. Whoops, I'm going to go back a slide. I just will give myself a brief introduction so you know who's giving the talk. My training was actually as a mechanical engineer from the University College Dublin a long time ago. That's all I'll say. It was in the previous century. I've been a certified pedorthist since 1996. I'm a quarterly contributor to the CPed magazine. I write articles for the CPed on various aspects of foot and ankle biomechanics, custom orthotics, shoes, and various other topics in that realm. I just recently stepped down from a position as a board member of the Pedorthic Foundation. And I can tell you the Pedorthic Foundation is a wonderful small not-for-profit in our profession. And what it does is it provides money for scholarships. So if somebody wants to become a certified pedorthist, or someone you know wants to become a certified pedorthist and they have a particular need, they could apply for a scholarship. And secondly, just as importantly, the Pedorthic Foundation offers money for grants and research into essentially anything to do with foot and ankle biomechanics or lower extremity orthotics or shoes. This field is very important to the care and the value it provides to our patients. And we need to just provide the scientific research and evidence to show the payers and to show the general public the value that is there. So if you have an idea for any sort of research, please feel free to reach out to the Pedorthic Foundation. Finally, in terms of disclosures, I am the co-owner of Hersco Ortholabs. That's the central fab in New York City. And I'm an investor in iOrthotics USA, which is a 3D printer of foot orthotics. And those are the two financial disclosures I have to make. Very good. So let's begin our class here. I'd like to start with a question. First of all, I would say, take a look at that picture. What do you see? Now, for some of us who live in the Northeast, we might recognize that. That's actually the New York City Marathon. I live in New York City, so I've gone to the marathon. Now, when I say I've gone to the marathon, I've actually gone and looked at it. I have not partaken myself. I've never run a marathon. But perhaps some of you are, in fact, marathon runners or 10K runners. This is on First Avenue. You've just crossed in from Queens. You're on First Avenue in Manhattan. You're heading north up towards the Bronx. Look how happy those people feel. That woman is there. Both hands are in the air. She's feeling good. That's around mile 15 or so. What she doesn't realize is the wall is still ahead of her. So she has to go north and she hits the Bronx and it gets very quiet up there. And that's when they say that people have to dig deep to turn around and come back into Manhattan and Central Park to finish the race. Those look like dollar bills on the ground. There is a lot of money in New York, but that's actually not money. That's drinking cups that have been discarded. In any case, before we start, just consider yourself. What are some of the major differences between walking and running? And it would be good to take out a piece of paper and maybe jot them down. So walking and running are different in several different ways. And we're going to essentially look at those differences in this class. What might they be? So we'll begin with a rudimentary description of running. Now, if you said running is faster than walking, well, that might be obvious. So that doesn't count for a point. But let's see what else we can come up with. Okay, so this is from the Oxford Dictionaries, a definition of running. Moving at a speed faster than a walk. Okay, so running is faster than walking, we know that. Never having both feet on the ground at the same time. That's the distinction that determines whether you're running or walking, regardless of the speed you're moving at. So running is faster than walking, but when you're engaged in the ambulation or the movement, but you don't have both feet on the ground at the same time, that's considered running. And if you were in the speed walking in the Olympics, that's what the judges will look out for. They'll keep an eye on you and they'll follow you and they'll make sure that one or both feet are on the ground at all times. And if not, you get a flag. And if you get, I forget, 3 flags, you're out of the event. And then the arguments begin. But that's the basic definition of running. And often the speed of running, a fast speed walker can walk faster than a slow runner. So the speeds will overlap, but the activity is defined based on having both feet on the ground at the same time, walking, or never having both feet on the ground at the same time, running. So if you never have both feet on the ground at the same time, then it means at some point in the cycle, you will have neither foot on the ground. And that's called double float. Again, that's the hallmark of running. So it's that instant in the cycle where you're flying through the air, if you will. And we see this graceful picture here. So you're never having both feet on the ground at the same time, which means at some instant or some fraction of the entire cycle, you will have both feet in the air. That's true unless you have exactly 50% stance phase and 50% swing phase. So we're going to look at the gait cycle for walking and running in a minute, and we'll distinguish the difference between the two. That instance where you're in the air is referred to as double float in some texts, and it's referred to as float in others. So we'll tend to use double float over the course of this talk. Oh, by the way, I'm a bit of a movie buff. So what I've done is I've interspersed a couple of running movies throughout the talk. If you like older movies, this is a classic. It's a British-made film called The Running Man from 1963. It's a good suspense film. It actually has very little to do with running. He's running from the law. He's not actually partaking in physical exertion, but it's a good film. Okay. Let's go back to walking and the gait cycle. Now, this is what we have studied in school regarding the gait cycle for ambulation. It's normal walking. It's a slightly different way to present it. So just as you go down the chart, well, let's start on the left-hand side. When you're walking, what Perry uses in her book for gait is that stance is 62% of gait. So the stance leg is on the ground for 62% of the cycle, which means the remaining 38%, the leg is in swing. So you have a long period of stance, 62, and a slightly shorter period of swing, 38. And because we switch from left leg to right, and then back to left, right, there are moments where we have double stance, where both feet are on the ground at the same time, or some portion of both feet are on the ground at the same time. And that's called double stance. So we see that initial double stance and terminal double stance, 12% in the example we're using here. It does not have to be these exact percentages, and it depends on a number of factors, including your stride length and the speed of your gait. But these are used as the reference points. Now, as you walk faster, your stance will shrink. So you'll go from 62% stance, walk a little faster, 60% stance, walk even faster, it might be 55% stance. That means the swing will be increasing in a commensurate fashion, 38% stance, 40% stance, 45% stance, until you get to a point where stance phase could be 50% and swing phase could be 50%. If you move any faster, or if your stance is any less than that, and it's now less than 50%, you're running. And typically with runners, you'll find they'll kind of reverse the numbers that we see in the gait cycle here. So they'll go from 60% stance, 40% swing when they're walking, to approximately 40% stance, 60% swing when they're running. But that will vary for each person, and it will depend on how fast you're moving. We have the classic labels for the phases of gait in the walking cycle here: initial contact, loading response, mid stance, terminal stance, and free swing. These we are familiar with and use them every day. And then there are the events that occur in gait: heel contact, forefoot loading, heel rise. That's the critical instant in the walking cycle where the heel lifts off the ground and you shift from mid stance into terminal stance. And finally, toe off, where you go into propulsion. Now, biomechanists do not use the same terms for the running cycle for good reasons. So we'll kind of overlay some of those terms with what happens in the running cycle so that we have good reference points to what we already know and understand. But they do use different words in the research papers. They don't just borrow what's being used in the gait books. Okay, so what are the hallmarks of walking? Well, a typical walking speed is 3 to 5 feet per second. Again, that's quite a broad range, and you'll find cases, especially in the rehab environments that we work in, where you could have people walking certainly more slowly than 3 feet a second and perhaps faster. But just as a broad outline, 3 to 5 feet a second. As we said earlier, walking will have some period of double stance. So there will be double stance at the beginning and end of the stance phase. And there will be no period of no ground contact. That means at all times, one or both feet will be touching the ground. Walking has been likened to, as an analogy, people gracefully falling forward and catching themselves with the leading limb. The swing limb hits the ground just in time so that you don't fall flat on your face. Another analogy that's used, it's called the inverted pendulum. So the foot is flat on the ground and the tibia crosses over the flat foot, just like an inverted pendulum, swinging back and forth in that way. So those are good analogies for walking, but they don't apply to running. So now, what are the hallmarks of running? Well, in comparison to walking, running is faster. So a typical speed range would be 8 to 14 feet per second. So you could say approximately 3 times larger. Again, there's quite a spread on the possibility of numbers there and speed. But there is a rule of threes that's applied to running that we'll talk about later in the talk. So running is approximately 3 times faster. There is no period of double stance. So at the very best, you'll have one foot on the ground, never both feet on the ground at the same time. And there will be some period of no ground contact, meaning with each stride, at some point, both feet will be off the ground, which means you'll be floating in the air. Now, the analogy that's often used for running is, rather than consider it as some sort of inverted pendulum or the various analogies used for walking, it in fact is very much like using a pogo stick and moving forward on that. Because on a pogo stick, there's a time when you're in the air, in float, double float, if you will, and then there's a time when you come crashing to the ground. But in coming down to the ground, you're actually loading the spring and then you're off again. So imagine you had the end of a pogo stick on each of your feet, on your sneakers, and you were hitting the ground, loading it, taking off, and then the other foot comes down, loading it, and taking off again. That would be a good basis to understand running. And we see the hallmarks of running in relation to walking there. Now, I apologize for the next few slides because we get into a little bit of theory, and we'll go through what is a classic running cycle as compared to Perry's gait cycle. I'll break this down over the next couple of slides. Then we'll look at some graphs of physics, which might scare some people. I find it interesting personally, but that's my problem. But Once we get through this, we'll go through it again, but we'll use pictures and it'll begin to make more sense. So we'll just get the language straight in the next few slides, and then the pictures will reveal a larger sense of what we're talking about. So look at this running cycle diagram here. Now, there's a lot of information there. So just start up top, and you'll see that there's an explosion, that little yellow burst over on the left-hand side. And then there's that arc, that blue arc or curve. That is the swing phase. So your leg is going through swing phase. And as I said, the traditional parameters for walking are 60% stance, 40% swing. Now they're reversed in this diagram here. So in swing phase in running, you could say, a regular runner not moving too quickly would have 60% swing. So where that blue arc is, that leg is off the ground moving through the air. So the first explosion is toe off. That's when the foot leaves the ground, the leg swings through the air, and then at some point later on, that foot then makes ground contact again, and that's initial contact. That's your landing. Now, the next phase is that black bar that says 40% stance. So for that time, that foot is on the ground, and it's going through some changes, which we'll discuss. And then at the end of that stance phase, you go back into swing again. So you're going from swing, stance, swing, stance. Now, if you look underneath at the blue columns, those are the periods of double float. They're at the beginning and the end of the swing phase. And then in between that, you've got those rectangles. So you've got a period of swing throughout that 60% phase. And then you've got a period of stance. That's the salmon colored square in the middle. So you're going from swing, stance, and double float in between those. And obviously the other leg is doing the same thing at exactly half the phase. And that's essentially a description of the running cycle. Finally, just look at the bottom of the graph and you'll see that there's these arrows, a green one, generation, and a pink one, absorption. So something is happening to your energy throughout the entire cycle. And we'll take a look at that. So let's take just a piece of that diagram and we'll go through it again in the same way. Now, the biomechanists changed the names for the phases of running, and that's what you see here on the left-hand side. So we'll begin with the diagram, and it shows that the initial contact, that initial explosion, is where the foot hits the ground. It's not always heel contact, and in runners and in elite runners, in fact, it's often mid-foot contact, and with elite runners and sprinters, it's often forefoot contact that makes the ground first. So your initial contact can be the forefoot in barefoot runners and in elite sprinters, trained runners, I should say. So your initial contact is the beginning of stance. That 40% then you're going through stance phase. And then at the end of the stance phase, you go into toe off or propulsion. That's the time when you're in double float. And then you go through that swing phase, which lasts for 60%. But that leg that just accelerated and propelled you forward remains in swing for the 60%. So the terms that are used for these different steps are initial contact. That's the same as in walking. The support phase is the first half of stance phase. That's where the foot is on the ground and it's supporting you. Now, halfway into the beginning through the first half of the support phase is called absorption, because the foot has hit the ground. It's slowing you down. Your knee is bending. Your knee is flexing. So you're absorbing energy. That will be used later on. But both of these things, the fact that you're dropping in height and you're flexing your knee, it's called the absorption phase. Later in the support phase, still halfway through stance, you begin to extend the knee. So now you're generating. So that's called the generation phase. And finally, there's toe off. That's the final propulsion as you launch yourself into the air. And then the swing phase is referred to as forward recovery. That's what they call it in the books. Okay. So now when you go back to the full diagram, it makes a little more sense, I hope. And you just see this nice choreograph of swing, a long swing phase, and then a stance phase, a long swing phase, and then a stance phase, moving through swing and stance with double float in between. And at different phases, you're absorbing energy and then you're generating energy, absorbing energy and then generating energy. Okay. We have one more set of graphs to do, and then we'll get to the pictures. So hang in there. Well, this is a classic, Marathon Man. It's set in New York City. I guess there's a theme to some of my selections here. It's a great movie. If you haven't seen it, I'd say rent it for the weekend. Although I don't make movie recommendations because sometimes people don't like them, and then they meet me the next time and they say, that was a terrible thing you said. This is a suspense film, except in this case, there is running involved. Dustin Hoffman was the Marathon Man. He, in fact, was a method actor, which meant that he wanted to get into the role and the persona of what he was portraying in the film. So he actually started running. I don't know if he ran a marathon, but he actually started running long distance to get ready for it. And when they shoot the scenes of him training, he actually did the training, which is funny. Because his co-star, Laurence Olivier, said to him, why do you do all this running? And Dustin Hoffman said, well, because, I want to get ready for the role. I want to play the part, from the inside out. And Laurence Olivier just said, well, why don't you do what I do, which is just act. So it might be far easier ways to earn a living than to be a method actor. In fact, he trained so hard for the movie. This is what he looked like. This is a still from the actual film. So he looks pretty ripped there, and it's a good movie. Okay. Now we're going to consider the energy in running, and we'll go back to our science classes, probably, I don't know, back in middle school at some point, on this idea of potential and kinetic energy. Now, the potential energy is the stored energy. It's often considered, the energy that's stored in something because of the height it's at. So if I take my phone here and I lift it up, then it'll have more potential energy when it's up here than when it's down lower. So the center of mass of the phone has been raised, so it has more potential energy. If I let the phone go, as it falls, it accelerates. The movement energy is the kinetic energy. Now, when we walk, it turns out that our potential energy and kinetic energy are out of phase. And that just means that when one of those is coming to a peak, the other is at its bottom. And then when the one that's at its peak drops down, the other one rises up. So the net effect of having your peaks out of phase, meaning the peaks are not occurring at the same time, but occurring at different moments, is you get a much smoother graph through the entire cycle, or you get a much smoother transfer of energy. So that's what walking does. Walking is a hugely efficient way to move the body forward. Nature has done a tremendous job of finding ways for us to be efficient. So this is a graph showing two different graphs, or two different what look like sine curves. So these sinusoidal waves, one of them shows kinetic energy. That's the black solid line. So that's going in a wavy pattern. And then the dashed line is showing potential energy. But take a look. The peaks of each of those are completely out of phase. They're 180 degrees out of phase. So they're occurring at different moments. That helps the transfer of energy. Now, when is the potential energy the highest in walking? Well, consider that for a moment. Potential energy, we said, is the energy of the center of mass in relation to a reference surface. So when is your center of mass highest in walking? Well, it would be when you're in mid stance. So just in mid stance, your foot is flat on the ground, your tibia is moving over your foot, your knee is straight. So in fact, at that moment, your center of mass is the highest. And if you're not sure of that, stand behind someone who's walking down a hall and watch them, and you'll see their head bobbing up and down. And in that moment of mid stance, they'll be highest. So their potential energy is highest at that point. But that's actually when they're moving the slowest, because they've now used their energy to get the center of mass up over the leg. And then they'll begin to accelerate forward later in the cycle as they finish mid stance and go into terminal stance. As you approach the end just before initial contact with the limb that's swinging, that's when you're moving the fastest. So your tibia has dorsiflexed on your foot and you're accelerating forward. The swing limb is forward and going to catch you from falling flat on your face, as we said. That's when your kinetic energy is the highest. So you're moving fastest at the end of the cycle, just before initial contact, and you're moving slowest at mid stance. So you have both of those occurring at different times. So throughout the whole thing, you have this nice transfer of energy back and forth. Your potential energy aids the kinetic energy. The kinetic energy moves you forward. The analogy that's often used, and this is in one of the textbooks called Human Walking by Vern Inman, Todd, and Ralston, I believe, is he has several beautiful diagrams, but one of them is essentially what looks like a scissors. And there's a time when you're moving and your center of mass is the highest, the red dot here. And then when your legs are furthest apart, you're just at initial contact with the leading leg, the center of mass will have dropped lower. So you get this idea of the weight, center of mass moving up and down. Okay, now running is different to walking, as we've proposed. So let's consider what's happening to your potential and kinetic energy when you're actually running. Well, it turns out that your potential energy and kinetic energy are in phase. That means they're both hitting their peak at the same time. So it's completely different. We're not swapping energies back and forth to keep an efficient gait cycle going. We're using both energies in a synchronous fashion to help propel ourselves forward. So go back to the mid stance point. In mid stance, in walking, potential energy is the highest. But in running, at mid stance, potential energy is the lowest. That means your center of mass is at the lowest point it's going to be in the entire cycle in mid stance. And that has significant implications, as we'll see. Now we can present that in its own graph, which we see here. Now, the important thing to recognize here, two important things. First of all, if you look at the y-axis, that's the vertical axis in the graph, and you see where those jewels are. I've made both graphs the same size, which I should not really have done, but I wanted to present it pictorially here. If you take a look at the running graph, you're going from 0 to 120. That's essentially 6 times higher than the walking graph. So there's a lot more energy expended in running. But if you can forgive that, that use of the graphs, I'm making them both the same. What I'm trying to compare is look at the peaks of both graphs. The kinetic energy for running, that DF is for double float, that peaks around the same time that the potential energy, the dashed line beneath it, peaks. So you're using both energies to go up and down at the same time. So they are what we call in phase. They're occurring together. Well, I hate to admit it, but I remember when this film was released. In fact, I went to see it in the cinema house myself. So that dates me in a certain way. Funny enough, I watched Blade Runner again about a year ago, and it's an excellent movie. It has stood the test of time, at least in my mind anyway. These are my recommendations. Okay, we have one more question and then we'll go to some pictures. So after dynamic propulsion, meaning after tow off, essentially, when you're now in double float, embarking on double float, in what directions will the body move? Well, what do you think? So you've just gone through stance phase, you've just gone through generation, you're now in the air, both limbs are in the air. In what directions will the body move? Well, let's begin with the obvious. Hopefully you move forward. That's the general plan here. You're running, so you want to go in a forward direction. Okay, that's good. Because you're going into double float, you would hope to move up as well. Absolutely. So you'll move in that direction too. But consider, well, what are the other planes? If you were above yourself or above a runner and you watch them, what might happen? You are now accelerating, moving a limb forward. That will have a torque on the body. That will actually tend to twist you in a certain direction because your legs are not at the center line of the entire center of mass. The legs are to the sides. So as you're moving a leg forward, and a leg is pretty heavy, it's 15% of your body weight. As you move that leg forward, that will have a lot of momentum, but it's slightly to the side of the center of mass. So in doing that, you would tend to put a twist on your motion. So if you weren't careful, you would tend to run down the street and you would move to the left and then the right, to the left and then the right. Generally, you would move forward, but there would be a twist in it. So how does the body account for that? The question is, how do we avoid swerving? Well, I think we know from even studying gait that arm swing is very important. That's the counter rotation that the upper body provides to prevent the momentum that the lower body needs in order to embark on double float. Swerving is completely off course. It keeps us very efficient, but it turns out that arm swing is even more important in running than in walking, certainly from an efficiency point of view. Okay, so that's the theoretical heavy lifting done. And now we're going to look at all of this by looking at pictures of sequential running. Now, when you look at that picture, you know, I mean, I know the first thing that you say to yourself, God, those are a fine pair of legs. Okay, but leaving that to one side, and we won't reveal the identity of the runner just yet. Take a look at another thing. This particular runner is wearing two different shoes. So maybe he's a bit of a klutz. You mightn't disagree, actually. But in taking these photographs, I actually did the running, and my daughter, God bless her, diligently volunteered to take the photographs. So this was outside on the street next to our building. And I had to run up and down many times to try and get the sequence of shots that I was looking for. So we did all that for an afternoon, came back in and looked at them, and we realized it's very hard to distinguish the left foot from the right foot in sequential shots of running. So we had to change one of the shoes and go back and do it again. So the left shoe, which is just about to hit the ground there, is the New Balance. That's the left foot, and then the blue shoe is the right foot. Okay, now we're going to look down at each of the different segments for the next 5 or 6 slides. So we'll talk about the arms and what they're doing. We'll talk about the energy, and by the energy, I mean the potential and kinetic energy. So we'll consider where the center of mass is for each slide. We'll look at the knee, see what is happening there. We'll look at the foot, what position the foot is in, and then the orthotic, what the orthotic should be doing at that instant, or what it may not be doing at that instant. When you look at that slide, another thing you could say is, wow, that's not a bad stride. The theoretically correct placement of the foot for a lot of running technique is to have the foot land flat underneath you as you make initial contact. You try to avoid heel contact because that sends a ground reaction force up and against the direction of motion. So you're trying to avoid that. So you begin with close to a foot flat. Okay. So we're going to begin our sequence here at stance phase reversal. We said that's the fancy term for what we would normally call mid stance. So in mid stance, the foot is flat on the ground. Now, in walking at mid stance, the leg would be straight and your center of mass would be the highest. But in running at mid stance, take a look. The knee is flexing. So the foot is flat on the ground or just a little instant past foot flat. The knee is flexing. What the knee is doing is, or what it has been doing, and the foot as well, the ankle joint, is it's been absorbing the momentum of the body mass coming down, but it's temporarily storing it in the muscles and the tendons actually. Muscles are tense and the tendons store the energy. So elastic energy is getting stored in the tendons, the Achilles tendon in particular. So starting from the top, the arms are in the neutral position. Your energy is the lowest here because you've hit the ground and you're kind of braking to some degree. So you're moving at the slowest point, or this is the slowest you will move in the entire cycle. So your energy is the lowest, both kinetically and potentially. Your center of mass is the lowest because you're on the ground and your knee is flexed. Your foot is plantigrade. So this is the moment when the foot orthotic will support you best. You'll have total contact with the foot orthotic, both in the heel and the arch, and you'll get the control from the device, heel to toe. Now, as we move to the next instant, we're now in the generation phase. So this is the fun part, if you will. It's also where the work is done. Now your arm is moving forward and up. Your energy is now beginning to increase, meaning your kinetic energy and your potential energy, because your center of mass is rising, because your knee is beginning to extend. At this stage, your foot should be resupinating, and the foot orthotic can affect and help the gait, but only if it has accommodations for the forefoot. So a lot of running orthotics will focus on forefoot accommodations because that's where it can do its work later in the gait cycle. And it's an important part of the gait cycle or the running cycle because you're now loading the foot and getting ready to generate and move up and forward. Now, this is a little later again. We still have foot contact, but now it's only just the forefoot. The arm is continuing to move forward. So the left foot is still on the ground and the left arm is moving forward and the right arm is moving backwards. So that's the counter rotation that we were talking about. Your energy, your potential energy is continuing to rise because your center of mass is rising. Your knee is continuing to extend as you lengthen it. And on the foot, you just have the toe rocker, which is in contact with the ground. The foot orthotic at this stage has done whatever work it can do. It will not really pertain to this aspect of the cycle. And now here we go, lift off. You're still in generation. It's the final instant where the toe is on the ground. The arms continue to move in that counter-rotating direction. Your potential energy is still rising. Your burst of energy is lifting you. The knee is straight, so the leg is straight, and the foot and foot orthotic are essentially at this stage just trailing. And now there's that magic instant of double float. The arms are still moving. Look at the right arm. It's moved all the way back at this stage. So you're almost at the end of its motion. Your energy is the highest because your center of mass is the highest. You're floating in the air. And your kinetic energy is the highest because there's no ground reaction force. There's no friction. You're sailing, if you will. So this is the enjoyable part of the cycle. But of course, all good things must come to an end, and you will come crashing to the ground pretty soon. During this period of double float, the knee, the foot, and the foot orthotic are moving, but they don't have an effect on the actual propulsion, if you will. Funny, I like to run and think of this cycle and realize, oh, when I'm actually running, I'm spending more time in the air than I am on the ground. So if you think of it that way, you can think of running as a series of movements through the air. And that might help you finish your training run or achieve your goal, if you will. A lot of people think running is plodding it out and fighting every step of the way. But it turns out that mathematically, at least, that's not the case. You're in the air and you're floating more than you are in stance. If that helps, I hope you enjoy it. I expect that everyone is going to go for a run after having seen this lecture. Okay. So we've gone through the double float and swing. We're still in double float here, but things are beginning to turn in a different direction. The body center of mass is now dropping, even though we're still in the air. The arms will begin to unwind. The leg muscles will tension in anticipation of ground contact. So your energy center of mass, your potential energy is dropping, but also your kinetic energy. You've gotten as much out of that propulsion as you can. So you're slowing down and you're dropping at the same time. Your knee is straightening in anticipation of ground contact. And then an interesting thing, take a look at the foot there. It may not be quite so clear in the picture, but your foot is going to be subject to some leg varus, meaning that the faster you run, your feet, which are normally hip width apart, will tend to move closer to the midline the faster you run. So you'll have what's called leg varus, meaning the leg angle will be closer to the midline, requiring the foot to do more pronation once it hits the ground. The foot orthotic is not yet in play, but it will be in the next instant. And there we go, boom, you hit the ground. So you're fully in absorption, you're back to stance phase, your energy center of mass is dropping, you're slowing down because you've hit the ground, and your knee is flexing again, absorbing some of that energy that it will be able to return to you later in the generation phase that's to follow. Your foot is now going through pronation. Not only is it going through pronation, it has to handle your body weight, it has to handle the momentum of your body coming down and having gone through the air so quickly. And finally, it has to handle the leg varus component of the fact that your foot is closer to the midline than it would normally be. And it has to do all of that, handle the momentum, handle your weight, and handle the leg varus increase. It has to do all of that in a much shorter amount of time than in a normal gait cycle. That's one of the reasons that it's good to recommend orthotics for runners. They may not need custom orthotics, but they should probably have some sort of support in there to help the foot as it moves through that increased load on a continuously repetitive basis for the length of their run. So your foot is pronating quite severely compared to your normal gait walking, and the foot orthotic is supporting you in this phase. Run, Forrest, run! The question I always have is, who is this guy's orthotist? So Tom Hanks there cuts a nice figure as a runner. That's great double float for him. There was an earlier scene in the film where he had leg braces, and whoever it was, I don't think the person was certified, because he went running down the lane and his braces fell to pieces. Maybe they didn't have super glue at the time, who knows? Okay, so here's a picture that just demonstrates this idea of leg varus. So as the runner is moving rather quickly, you can see the angle of the leg is towards the midline. So the faster you run, the closer towards the midline your foot will land. That is mainly due to efficiency. It's far more efficient to have your feet land closer to the midline rather than have them land side to side and have your weight sway back and forth with each stride. So it makes it very efficient to have the feet land towards the midline. You remain stable because of the speed at which you're moving. But take a look at the angle of attack of that foot that foot has to come down onto the ground and go to foot flat. And it has to do that with increased rate of repetition, the momentum of the running, and in a shorter amount of time. So it goes through that pronation more forcefully and more quickly than if you were just walking. So that's why runners need protection for their feet. It's one of the reasons, because the leg varus increases the efficiency of your run, but it absolutely increases the subtalar joint pronation, the demand for the subtalar joint pronation. Okay, so now we're going to switch to some videos. I'm just going to show you the video through and see if we can pull it up here. So let's go here. Okay. So I'm going to show this video. I'm going to just talk through it. If we were doing this class live, I would probably slow it down and stop it at each step. But we'll just play it through, and more than anything, just take a look at the rhythmic movement of the body. So, you know, up and down, up and down. Look at the hips in relation to the handlebar on the treadmill. Look at the arm motion back and forth. Running is a most marvelous way to move. Again, our daughter gracefully agreed to be my videographer here. All right, the picture resolution is not great, but if you do this for yourself, you'll see there's a lot of leg varus there. In fact, the feet almost seem to crisscross each other as you make the ground contact. Okay, so we'll go back to the slides. I'm just going to pull them back up here. There we go. Okay, so I just show you that to suggest you can easily do that with your own runners, or you can do it for yourself to understand the gait cycle. And if you do that with your phone or do it with a GoPro, you can slow that down and go through it frame by frame, and you'll be surprised what it reveals. A lot of the stuff we've talked about in the lecture all of a sudden become apparent when you can see it. Seeing is believing, they say. Here's another great movie. I had never even heard of this guy until I saw the film. His name was Steve Prefontaine, truly a running legend. The guy was remarkable. He was a West Coast runner. His specialty was actually the 2 miles, and he desperately wanted to be a 1 miler, but his coach realized he was unnaturally talented at the 2 miles. And it's a great story. Fully recommend it. I like to think that was me when I was younger, but it wasn't. Okay, so we're coming near the end here. We just go through the unique characteristics of running, just to make it distinct. So it's really a recap of what we've spoken about. So let's begin with the obvious. What makes running unique? Well, running is faster. You could say 3 times faster. Of course, it depends on how fast you're running. It depends on who's chasing you. But running is faster than walking, generally speaking. The ground reaction force loads are higher. There's a lot more momentum. Your body weight is moving more quickly when you're running. So you do have higher loads. And sometimes they say, well, I'll just go to the 3rd slide. The leg varus increases, meaning that your leg hits closer to the midline when you're running. And if you're not sure of that, you know, on some quiet day, lace up your runners and out you go for a run. Run down the middle of the street or go to the park where they have a painted line. And you'll find it's quite easy to place your foot on the painted line with each step. Whereas if you're to walk, that'll be quite difficult. It'll feel like you're wobbling as you go. So that's a demonstration of this idea of leg varus, the narrower base of gait. Now they say the rule of 3s for running in general is you run 3 times faster, the ground reaction forces and the loads are 3 times higher, and the leg varus increases by a factor of 3. So that's 3 threes. That's not exactly true, but it is a general rule of thumb. And when you're treating runners, you can consider those factors when you're evaluating, their existing sneakers and their orthotics and the diagnosis that they present with. Obviously, each step is more frequent and each step is longer. So when you're running, you're getting the advantage of both more frequent steps, more steps per minute, and you're getting a longer stride with each swing. The combination of those is what makes you faster. So you're taking more steps more frequently, so you can move quite fast. Running, it turns out, is a hugely efficient activity also. And there's a book called Born to Run. It's a very readable book. It's not a textbook in any way. It looks at the development of humans, the evolution over the last couple of million years. And essentially, the book title tells the story. We were born to run. And it's a very efficient way to move around the world. That goes back to our hunter-gatherer days, I suppose. Okay, now technically, just as a recap, running has no period of double stance, meaning you at best you only have 1 foot on the ground at any given time. That's actually the definition of running. As a result of that, if you're moving with a swing phase of 60%, 55%, or sprinters will have a swing phase that's even longer. It can almost approach 80% swing phase, 20% stance. Running has 2 periods of double float. Those instants when you're in the air and neither limb is touching the ground. That's the other hallmark of running. When you're running, potential and kinetic energy are in phase. So those peaks for both of them are occurring at the same time. And that's helping you with the propulsion. Arm swing aids lift, so it does help get you up in the air. But more importantly, arm swing helps cancel the angular momentum. So as your lower limbs are swinging forward, your upper body is counter-rotating so that your center of mass moves efficiently in a straight line forward and doesn't swerve left to right. And as we touched on just briefly, the tendons act as springs, returning the energy. So the muscles tense in anticipation of instants such as initial contact. And then the energy is stored elastically in the tendons, the Achilles tendon in particular. And as long as you're moving quickly enough and you take quick steps actually can make running more efficient. The tendons will return that energy almost instantaneously, making running itself very efficient. Finally, an inspirational film. This was more recent. We brought the kids to see this one. McFarland, USA. It's a great film with Kevin Costner about kids in California. Well worth a look. Okay, so the references that I drew on for this talk were essentially the Biomechanics of Distance Running. That's a great textbook. It's edited by Peter Kavanagh. It's been around, I hate to say it, almost 30 years, but it's the best one that I could find, and it's full of all sorts of studies from different authors, and Kavanagh compiles it all into this running Bible, if you will. So if you're interested in the biomechanics or more the physiology of what we've spoken about, that's the place to go. If you'd like just a reference paper that kind of summarizes what we've looked at, the Biomechanics of Running by Novacek is excellent, and the Anatomy and Biomechanics of Running by Nicola and Jewison. You can probably search those on PubMed, and those are papers that summarize some of the main components of running. On the HRSCO website, we do have articles in our education center. There's 2 on the biomechanics of running. The first one, which is the one you see there, the Biomechanics of Running, summarizes essentially this talk. as I've given it. So if you want to go back and kind of get an in-depth read on what we've spoken about, that would be a good place to start. There is a second article there, the Biomechanics of Running 2, which looks at some of the injuries that can occur when you're running, and also then some of the orthotic prescriptions that you might write to prevent those injuries. And they're nice summaries and starting points for this subject if you're interested. And with that, I will say thank you very much. It's been wonderful to share this time together. Hopefully you've learned something here. I would suggest more than anything, go for a run. You might run and you might see it differently if you take some of this information and put the sneakers on. I'm always open for questions. So if you have any interest, feel free to email me. And that closing slide there is the closing slide from another great movie called Chariots of Fire, the English track team from the early 20th century. So good luck in your studies. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again. Take care.